Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Where Does It Come From podcast. Here we are in January 2023. We're approaching Blue Monday, and I think quite a few of us are thinking about how we can go on holiday this year and how we can do it in a sustainable way. So this time I've got the wonderful Vicky Smith with me. Hello, Vicky.
Hello.
And she runs a sustainable travel organisation called Earth Changes, and she's also a real expert in anything to do with sustainable travel. So, first of all, Vicky, can you tell us a bit about yourself, about your organisation, and tell us how you got involved with sustainable travel?
Thanks, Jo. So, Earth Changes is a collection of curated accommodations and tour operators who are built from core for the purpose of positive impacts through tourism. What that means is when you go on holiday, it's not necessarily having to be hands-on with volunteering or anything like that. You can have a lovely beach holiday, but behind the scenes, they're putting their money into sustainable development projects locally, and that might be things like education, health, conservation, climate initiatives, you name it. So basically every trip has a contribution to the destination. And the reason for that is that traditionally tourism doesn't do that. Traditionally tourism basically exploits from a destination, uses its resources, uses its people, and really those people never get to share the benefits of what the profits are from tourism, basically. It's just the way that the industry has evolved in a not very nice way, basically.
So, basically, in the past and still currently, tourism has been about taking.
Yes,
and what
absolutely. So
what you're
we call
talking
it
about is giving.
it's extractive. Yes.
Yeah, extracting, and we're giving back good.
And one of the big reasons for why that's so important is tourism is one of the biggest sectors in the world. So it's 10% of all jobs worldwide, 10% of all GDP worldwide, and so on average. And then you talk about if you talk about sort of Caribbean islands or any destinations like that, we're talking about sort of 50% GDPs and jobs. Yeah. So it's a really significant impact to a destination. And most people, obviously, when they go on holiday, they don't necessarily want to think about the sustainability of things. They're going on holiday. But in actual fact, tourism is probably the sector most or best placed in the world out of all global sectors to actually deliver, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals in a place, because unlike something like mining, for example, which is also extractive, that just is in one place, whereas tourism goes into all corners of the world, apart from war zones, pretty much.
And even then sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because as you say, people don't want to think about it when they're going on holiday. But if you do force yourself to think about it, it's a good time of the year to start thinking about making changes. You can easily see that if you're booking with a company, a centrally globally based company, a lot of the money that you're paying isn't even going to be going to that destination, is it?
No, not at all. So on average, probably you're lucky if 10% of your money would end up in a destination, and 90% doesn't. And that's, yeah, like you say, global profit centers based in, I don't know, US, UK, whatever it is. And so, yeah, I mean, for me, in running Earth Changes, one of the reasons I exist is to funnel bookings directly into the partners that we work with. We do earn a commission off it, but basically the money goes to them first and then they pay me, rather than it be the other way around. So in many ways, I'm sort of trying to turn the tourism traditional model on its head.
So you're basically checking out and building relationships with these
yeah, I mean, ultimately, I suppose sustainability in tourism, I think, is quite complex for people, because it is this whole mixture of everything. So it's energy, construction, waste, water, staff benefits, food procurement, services, transport, all these things, and they all have obviously their own sustainable or not supply chains. And so in order to kind of go, is this place sustainable or not, it's not a black or white thing. There's a lot of trade-offs, there's a lot of potential work that can be done in tourism to make tourism more sustainable. So that's quite complex for the consumer. They want something to say, yes, it's good, or no, it's not. And I suppose ultimately I'm in the position to be able to judge that generally. And so I work with the guys who are real best practice at all sustainability across the board. And, they are set up not just to do it as a sort of marketing angle, if you like. It's very much because they want to deliver benefits for their local people and places.
And one thing I really like about your website, which people want to go and have a look, it's earth-changes.com, isn't it?
Correct. Yes.
You've actually got a list there of various countries, but also the people behind it, the key experts. So you're getting to know people. It's that whole transparency. You're getting to know the people behind these holiday destinations, which is fabulous.
Yeah, I interview them, and you know, exactly for that reason is so much of how an organization is run comes from whoever set it up and why they've done it. So it's to sort of introduce people really to the motivating factors of why does this person care about these issues? Why have they created tourism? What have they done before? What are the influences in their life that led them to that? And then another section, which is our purpose section, is all about the sustainable development goals and how they interrelate with tourism. And as far as I know, and have yet to be corrected, I was the first commercial company in the world to write about that.
Well done.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll take that.
So that leads me on to you then, Vicky. So tell us a little bit about you and what got you so involved in sustainable tourism.
Well, good question. I studied French and international business at university, and I was also a big fan of skiing. And so after university, I wanted to go and spend some time in the French Alps, both to improve my language and to be able to ski. And I was definitely advised by my university at the time, it's a long time ago now, that it would ruin my career if I took a year out. And I said, you know what, no, I'm going to go do 6 months of ski season and 6 months traveling the world. And then I'll come back and seriously think about a job when I get back. And I didn't really also want to spend my whole last year of university applying for milk round jobs and graduate recruitment. And I did do some, but literally it made me feel quite sick. It was a bit too corporate for me. So off I went and did a ski season, found that I learned much more than even my friends in graduate recruitment jobs in London, because you're dealing with real world issues and real people. And then did my travel, and then I was offered a job back with the same company for the next winter, bigger resort, more staff, more chalets, more bigger operations, more guests every week. And so I carried on as long as I was learning something new and enjoying it, basically. And in working in tourism at the coalface like that, if you end up with a career in tourism, and it's the best start, because you know really what are the guest wants and needs, how do the logistics work, how does the sort of business model and everything work, what are the challenges, etc., etc. It's extremely hard work, don't let anyone tell you otherwise, but also a bit of fun here and there, obviously. And I found I really liked people that worked in travel, ultimately, because everyone shares a passion for travel. And you know, I developed that passion for independent travel in between seasons, and it, you know, offers a great balance for doing that. And then when I came back to the UK, now I'd been stuck up mountains in the Alps in the sort of mid to late 90s, and came back to the UK right at the end of the 90s. And the internet had proliferated or started penetrating, let's say, in between, since I'd been at university, really. And my stepfather was a network engineer, and he had home all kitted out. And so I was quite fascinated with this internet tech. And so I actually then got a job with an international conference organization firm for a couple of years, running events on internet tech in travel and how travel industry was starting to be affected, and also aviation and also various other sectors. And then ultimately through doing that, learned about a lot about internet tech. And then I was basically poached back by a travel company to head up their web development commercial operation. And that was teletext, if you remember teletext. So what used to be on analog TV for us, sort of, you know, 70s, 80s kids, whatever, which was where the UK, prior to the internet, booked all its last minute holidays, got its weather reports, got its snow reports. So we were actually the biggest single source of holiday sales in the UK at that point in time. So it was my job to translate that onto digital platforms, but initially website, and then also digital TV. And so in doing that, I ended up, well, initially I was responsible for ski, and then ended up responsible for overseas holidays. But that exposed me to the very mass market of the travel industry, because such is teletext. And it was a particular trip. I actually went to Kenya to a friend's wedding. I got a cheap deal through work, stayed at an all-inclusive. And suddenly I became very aware that, you know, what was my idea of travel, which was to experience local culture, local people, go to local bars, see the wildlife, went on safari, all these things, wasn't what most people were doing at this place I was staying at. And they were there to eat, drink, tan as much as they could. They could have been anywhere, They were literally, many people were there in between sign-on periods, in all honesty. They were getting away to just some sun, and they certainly didn't go on safari. They didn't talk to local people. The hotel told them not to even go outside the walls, and they were very happy just to obey. And the hotel was just trying to keep money within the walls of the all-inclusive. And then you had this sort of polarity with the all-inclusive ghetto, if you like, and the poverty outside, and seeing kids going through, you know, piles and piles of rubbish and plastic. And this is the mid 2000s, early 2000s. You know, really for the first time probably in my life, I saw that. And the amount of plastic, and that was all plastic that was created by tourism. You know, they wouldn't have had that otherwise, and they didn't have the local services to be able to deal with it. And suddenly it struck me, this industry I worked in, you know, it wasn't just tourism or travel, it was this behemoth of this kind of, you know, conveyor belt of tourism industry that was exactly that, exploitative. We'll use it, we'll take it, but we're not going to sort out our mess. And I felt very, very responsible for that. And I suddenly, I went around the pool where I was, and I asked people where they booked and what they were doing. And they pretty much all booked through where I was working. And I just thought, it's all my fault. I'm facilitating this though. I don't want to be part of this. It's not the travel that I believe in. And at that point in time, responsible tourism as a term literally got coined that year. And so I came across that and went, that's the tourism I like. That's what I care about. I care about people and places. And so that sent me off on a new direction. And I then went and worked for the biggest tour operator getting involved in responsible tourism at the time in the UK. So I sort of switched client side, I suppose, from teletext. And that didn't work out to be, it was quite a PR job for them at the time. That didn't work out to be that great. And so I went and spent some time in Africa. So I literally traveled around Africa volunteering and really trying to understand where travel or tourism could fit in, should fit in, whether it was helping, where it wasn't. I saw a lot of, you know, issues around health, obviously, resources, water, you know, things that require sustainable development. And what I would now call travel for sustainable development or tourism for sustainable development, I probably realized at that point that's what I wanted to do. It just didn't have a name yet. So, you know, responsible sustainable tourism is still quite sort of nascent industry, really. So we're still only 20 years in the making so far. So yeah, I've been involved ever since, really. That was it. I very much said, that's it. I'm only working in this going forward, because I don't see really sort of the purpose of helping big corporates make lots of money to exploit people in beautiful destinations.
That's really interesting.
And I come from a point of wanting equality in the world and supporting those within equality. So travel is such a huge engine, as I talked about earlier, economic engine, and powerful, you know, for influence, that, well, if you can have a good impact, why not, rather than have a bad impact?
Exactly. It doesn't make much difference to the person who's going on the trip.
No, and it doesn't necessarily make much difference to prices. No, exactly. The business case for sustainability, once you factor in energy, water, waste efficiencies, all that sort of stuff, actually is much better. So, and it's a better customer experience. It's been proven, responsible sustainable tourism, you get higher customer satisfaction levels because there's attention to detail of just things like food procurement, local, less food miles, organic, better tasting, staff are looked after so they respond to guests better. Everyone just has a nicer time, basically. Quality aspect.
I think it's that there's definitely that, but I think there's also, as we both know, and I'm sure most people listening know as well, the more you mentally put into something, the more you get out of it. So if you are just going somewhere to lie on the beach, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know, but if you are mentally thinking, where am I going? What's this society like? You will get more out of it. Anyway, I wanted to, you gave me a nostalgic moment there, which is something I'd completely forgotten about. In my in a previous life when I worked for BT, one of my roles was to go out to the ABTA national conference in it was in
why did you go there from BT?
Because I was seconded at the time to one of the sales sector, which was the leisure and travel sector, and my role was basically to communicate upcoming technologies, internet technologies, basically, which was becoming big. So in the late 90s I took a stand out of demos to ABTA on behalf of BT to basically show people what internet booking could be like, how things are going to change technology wise. And we actually provided the keynote speaker as well, who was one of our chief researchers, who talked about, it was called The Glimpse of the Future. And I remember it was really great. I really enjoyed it. But the speaker was talking about how the internet was going to come along and travel agencies were going to disappear and people were going to do all their booking on the internet. He basically got laughed out of the auditorium. You know, they sort of listened to him respectfully and then just thought, this is a load of old rubbish. This is pie in the sky, you know. And we've been working in, this was probably, I don't know, 98, 97, 98. And he was saying these things. And I just remember they have no idea. You know, I realized he was completely right, because we could see the technologies coming along, but it was just crazy. They did not know how it was going to get turned on their head. Anyway,
and actually, exactly, me saying I was facilitating it, in actual fact, that the sort of advent and development of internet tech led to no-frills flights and possibilities of, you know, if you remember the early days of Ryanair flights, 99p, you would literally jump on your computer when it happened. It's like, well, where can we go, you know?
Exactly.
But that has created so much of that mass travel movement without thought for the destinations. Can they handle that number of people? Same with cruise ships, you know, that kind of A to B booking that you can get on the internet is great in some ways. You can get people into destinations they would otherwise not think about, but on the other hand, there's little thought for the impacts that creates.
Exactly.
And so, you know, sustainable tourism is very much about saying, you know, as we know, not just sort of emotional gut feel, but based on evidence of a balanced approach of economy, society, and environment. Is this a good or a bad thing, you know?
So anyway, you moved me on to my second point, which was going to be, tell me about what the key issues are at the moment in travel and what are the trends heading towards sustainable travel.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, travel represents the world. So all the key issues are the world's key issues, which are climate, biodiversity, and inequalities. I'd say the big three. Right. And so, you know, obviously when people think about sustainable tourism, often the first thing they think about is aviation and how can you have travel, you know, if you're flying. And I think a lot of people don't know the facts around what emissions percentage aviation is. So for example, global aviation in tourism is about 2.5% of global emissions.
Yeah.
Now that burns at an altitude which has a slightly magnifying effect, so it can be sort of 3-4%, 5% max probably impact, if you like. What you have to do is you have to weigh that up against what travel brings to destinations and for those people and places, which is obviously economy, it's jobs, it's whatever. So if I often look at the least developed countries because they're the ones who are probably most dependent on tourism, and they don't have other industries that bring in that money. So as I said earlier, if they are probably reliant, their tourism for them is probably 40% of income, something like that, and 40% of jobs, up to, in terms of their exports, you're talking 80% for sort of islands and stuff. If you take aviation away for some of these places, well, basically the vast majority of the population then doesn't have a job, or you know, half the population doesn't have a job. And if they haven't got jobs, they haven't got incomes, they can't support their families, they can't do development, and you know, let's say goodbye to all those countries basically that tourism is in their top, if not the top three sectors. So it's really important that we keep a balance between what destinations want tourism. You know, they don't want people to stop flying. Most travelers don't want to stop traveling, right?
Yeah.
And it's just, how do we do it better? So the big onus is obviously on how we can replace jet fuel with a sustainable alternative. And obviously the big sort of obvious answers are, how can we travel without flying out of choice, because other transport options do have less of an impact. So let's minimize it where we can. Let's minimize the number of sort of short weekend hops that we do, because actually just do your one big trip a year like we used to, or two, whatever. We don't need to travel for business. We've seen that in COVID. Yes, occasionally it's nice to meet people, but we don't need to do the extent. So if we chopped business flights, and if we sort of chopped weekend flying and stuff like that, and it's private a very, very big dint at that point in time.
And private jets, because
people are going
all over the place.
Totally unnecessary, right?
Yeah.
Totally ridiculous. So I think, you know, my line is absolutely chop unnecessary flying. You don't need it. However, aviation as a whole does support destinations. And so, you know, yes, there's a climate impact, but we can't take SDG 13, Sustainable Development Goal 13, separately from all the other Sustainable Development Goals. It's not just one thing, you know, it has an impact then on the others. And so we need to consider how the others all balance in with the impacts of tourism as well, which then brings me to sort of biodiversity, and inevitably climate links in with biodiversity. So tourism is probably the sector that basically funds conservation. Yes, conservation has donor funding as well, but you know, those people have to also go and see projects, but a lot of funding comes from actual tourism. So if we take flying away, then you haven't got people going to see elephants, rhino, tiger, lion, whatever endangered species. Let's wave goodbye to their funding at that point in time, because that's mostly where it comes from. And so you know, biodiversity is obviously incredibly important to tourism. The big motivators for tourism are obviously weather, which we can talk about as being climate, nature, which is our biodiversity, and culture, which is our inequalities in people, society. So really the currency of tourism is the triple bottom line of sustainability. And all the more reason, right, we've got to sort out the sustainability in travel, because as an industry, if we don't, it's probably the most suicidal sector. And
it reminds me a lot of fashion, what you're saying, or clothing, yes, because of this message of overconsumption again. And what you're saying to people, what I say to people about textiles, is you need to buy far less, but you need to buy really well.
Yeah.
So you're looking
buy less,
at
buy better.
Buy less, buy better, but you're looking at the impacts of everything that you buy, every choice that you make, yeah, on the people making it and the planet. And no one's saying don't buy anything. What they're saying is buy carefully and with kindness, isn't it? And it's exactly the same message for tourism.
And that requires a lot of information about what's happening in those supply chains, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, me as a company, I exist to help people with that information, to explain, you know, transparently, what are these organizations that I partner with? What makes them so great? What are they doing? How are they helping? You know, what are their plans? And so, yeah, I mean, tourism has such a huge impact on all the sustainable development goals. You know, it supports kids in education quite often. It supports capacity building for people's jobs, training, women in work in particular. You know, tourism is majority female, particularly at the lower echelons. So, you know, the gender equality, sustainable development goals, you know, we're a bit buggered if we haven't got tourism for that as well.
Yeah.
So it's such, you know, I don't agree with the sort of no fly full stop, because it's such an important balance to sustainable development as the future as a whole. And we have to, as much as the, you know, the sustainable development goals are really great for helping us understand those issues separately, but we can't look at them as just sort of, you know, completely separate. They interrelate, and we have to look at it holistically, and we have to look at a holistic balance about what is a net positive impact, be it for nature, be it for climate, whatever.
Definitely. You're making me think as well. One criticism that we often get as ethical enterprises, I guess, is too much information, isn't it? And people's, I don't want to think about that. I just want to make even my husband says to me, sometimes I just want to buy something. I'm like, okay, but it's how do we make it easy for people to know, you know? And it is really, really difficult. It's almost like, and we've also become attuned as a society to the 3-word message, you know, as well. So it's how do we simplify those messages? I like the 3 things you came up with just then, the biodiversity, etc., because those are 3 key messages that people can relate to, can't they? This is what I'm looking for.
And you know, I'm very fortunate in that most people can relate to travel, right? And tourism, it's something they enjoy. So it's a great sector to work in, but they, on the flip side, they don't really want to think about the sustainability of it, because they want the fun of it without the seriousness of it, right?
Yeah. And
like you said, it's very similar to fashion. We have a lot of issues around water usage. You know, you talk about islands and you'll find that tourists use, I've forgotten the actual stats, but you know, 100 times the water a day that a local does, and the local doesn't have access to the water sources, but the tourists do. You know, terrible things like that, which just shouldn't occur, quite frankly. No. And you know, in many ways, I'm coming on to COVID now, COVID's been extremely tough, obviously, on the travel sector, but it's also kicked the whole sector up the bottom. So whereas before, you know, you were talking about internet tech and the guy who no one believed him or whatever. You know, I started in sustainable tourism 17 years ago now, And everyone was just like, what? Didn't know what it was. Went through that stage of everyone laughing at me, went through the stage of people then thinking, okay, well, yes, but it's a niche product. And then it's like, well, it's just a marketing angle or whatever. It will never be anything. And the difference that I've seen pre-COVID to post-COVID is enormous in travel. I mean, literally, it is a 10-year acceleration in the space of 2.5 years by the rest of the industry, who are suddenly now taking it seriously. And they're suddenly now realizing this applies to everybody, because if it's not the default in future, our industry will be, say goodbye to your business, basically. We've seen, and partly COVID's shut down, lockdown tourism.
Yep.
We saw 120 million jobs lost roughly across the whole world. We saw I think the official stats now are about 75% decline of the industry in 2020, but that was based on obviously March onwards. So the sort of, if you'd applied that across the whole year, it would have been probably 80% plus, 85%. $120 trillion. I mean, I don't even know what that is, right?
No, it's a lot of zeros. That is
a lot of money. And massive impacts for, like I said, less developed countries or island states who lost 80% of their whole economies in the 2 years, 2020, 2021. And so what effect that had on like companies here, for example. We saw a lot of companies going bust, and some really high profile ones.
Yep.
Some big airlines, STA Travel was a big casualty, and people didn't have the cash flow. Basically, if you were a tourism business based on debt and you had to service that debt, right, well, say goodbye because you've got no income. So we had no government support for tourism. So in this country, in the UK, the government made outbound tourism illegal, but didn't yet support anyone who worked within that sector, unless you were a big company and you could get the furlough that other big companies were able to access, but certainly not me. And so, we had a lot of casualties in the industry, and that's now playing out because so many staff left the sector and got jobs elsewhere, and now they're not coming back because, you know what, they get paid more elsewhere because tourism is not a highly paid sector. And so we've got massive staff shortages, which we've seen in the last year or two, right, even coming to this point. Massive problems with airline schedules and things like that. Again, same reasons. We've obviously coming into fuel crisis and cost of living crisis and all that sort of thing. So there's an awful lot that the sector's had to deal with. I was actually on a networking call yesterday, and one of the biggest issues that travel agents around the world are actually dealing with now is managing customer expectations, because customers are going away possibly for the first time since pre-COVID. They've got high expectations because they want a special holiday because they haven't had one for a while. The sector, in the meantime, has been totally obliterated. Has lost most of its staff. This new staff aren't necessarily skilled like previously or what have you. And so it's a really, really, really challenging time. And I mean, for me, I'm very lucky as a small startup that I was able to sort of cover my costs just because I was small. And I now need to scale. Interesting times, definitely trying to get through.
I know, because I think you've met Travel with Jules before. She's a local contact of mine, a business customer in the past as well. But she's had a terrible time over the last few years. So she had to let her staff go. And basically, I think she had to take a loan out against her house and all sorts of things. But one of the problems was, but customers were still going to her throughout COVID to try and get, so she had to rearrange trips because with the constant, so she was working the whole way.
So when you're doing postponements, cancellations, anything like that, rearranging everything, there's no money in that.
No, no money at all.
Your whole time is taken up for work doing that.
Exactly. So I think it's one of those things that I personally feel like we need to support people like you and people like Jules, and
I carried on marketing throughout because all my partners, suppliers that I work with in destinations, because they are dedicated to their communities, because they exist for that reason, they continued with their full staff and continue paying them as much as possible, certainly more than they would live on, sort of thing, not to the nth degree of cut. They might have cut a little bit. And they supported their communities with things like feeding programs. I mean, one place in South Africa, which is a phenomenal place, did 100,000 free meals and that was from their tourism income, but they've got no tourism in that time. So they were paying out. So as long as they were supporting their communities and doing lots of charitable initiatives, obviously I want to carry on supporting them. They're now, in debt, probably enormously. We've got potentially, years to have to make that up. But at the same time, COVID really sort of, sifted the men from the boys in tourism, because you saw how people reacted. And you've got great people like the suppliers I work with, and they all stepped up and they all supported their communities and they all did amazing work. And that's the benefit of booking through someone that where someone's vetted real sustainable suppliers, because there's that support network basically going on, and it's much more personal and emotional and dedicated ultimately.
Well, again, it's the same as fashion.
It's not for marketing,
It's very similar in clothing and fashion as well. You get the relationships with the people that have shared values with you, have a shared community drive with you. The same thing, the cooperatives that we work with, they carried on paying people, supporting people right through even though and then you hear of big companies in fashion who, for example, weren't paying their bills, weren't paying people for garments that they'd already had made, but they just didn't pay the bill because they couldn't sell them. So there's a difference between being completely in it for profit and being in it as part of a bigger community picture, which is obviously what you're doing and what we're doing.
And particularly like areas, so where the lodge I was talking about that did the feeding program, historically they've got bad unemployment in the region anyway, and suddenly you've gone from something like 10% unemployment to 50% unemployment, and it's just like, goodness, how can you, as one lodge that maybe has 30 rooms or something, support all these hundreds of people, thousands of people, but so vital to build those relationships if you can, because in the future, that community cohesion and how you work as a lodge then with your community in the future is the community will support you in the future over that, of course.
So that brings me on nicely to greenwashing, because we obviously know that many companies are saying they're responsible, saying they're doing these sustainable things. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, did you know greenwashing as a term was invented in tourism?
No, I didn't.
Yes. So it was actually invented by a New York journalist in, I think, 1986 to describe it was a Samoan hotel it's like a surf hotel, who were ostensibly not washing towels for the sake of the reef and the environment. And realistically, they weren't doing it because they were just saving money, basically. So that's where the greenwashing term came from. So yes, it's rife in tourism. And it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there are people who, we're expecting to see a lot more in tourism. Like, it's going to be now, like I said, there's this massive interest, 10-year fast forward acceleration in the industry interest in sustainability. So we'll have people saying they're sustainable, responsible when they're not. The challenge is whether they think they are, sometimes.
Yeah, they're doing their...
So sometimes some people might think in the best of intents, but it's because we're, sustainability is on a sort of continuum. It's not a black or white. It's an onwards journey, almost endless, limitless of what you can do. And so if you're early into it, you might think, yes, I'm doing an amazing job, but you're just not aware of how big that job is going to end up being, basically. So there are people who won't do it intentionally but are doing it, and there are people who will do it intentionally because they know the consumer demand is shifting to out of choice. If you've got a choice between that one and that one, do you pick the more sustainable? Yes, I'll pick the more sustainable. So they're saying it in order to get the bookings, basically. So the difference, as with any sector, is about the evidence. Is you can't say you're sustainable, responsible unless you can show you are. You've got proof, and that means measuring and monitoring. And so we're actually starting to see in tourism, as we get this increase in interest in sustainability, both from a consumer demand and a supplier side, we're seeing more movement into certifications, into measuring and monitoring systems. I actually did a bit of consultancy recently, so I survived through doing a bit of side, private consultancy, and I've been helping one company with a data monitoring system, basically, which is enormous. I mean, it's like the Google Analytics of sustainable tourism impact data. So that's really interesting that that's happening. And, you know, consumers will come to learn that you have to ask, if you're making that claim, why, how, where's the money going, what's going on with that. You know, it does make the booking thing more complex. And then companies who, you know, people who don't want to get into those questions, they'll come to specialists like me who just say, where can I go in Costa Rica? And I'll tell you, and I'll, you know, hopefully have the, you know, I've got the reputation of the knowledge and the recommended, you know, decent approach, basically. So,
but it's hard to see through the greenwash, though, isn't it? And as a consumer, I mean, we're looking at our trips for this year already. We love to travel as a family, tend to go by train, but we're always very conscious of what do you look for, you know? And if someone says they're sustainable, what questions do you ask, you know? And it is quite a complicated one. I mean, again, putting it back to fashion, because that's obviously my thing, but when you've got organizations saying we have the conscious collection, we're fully, I don't know, ecological cotton, and you look at it, you think, no, you're not, no, you're not, as an expert, but as a person on the street, you don't have that background knowledge to build it up. So what can people look for?
Yeah, I mean, I actually wrote my master's thesis on greenwashing in tourism, funnily enough, actually around volunteer tourism in particular. And I looked at both how volunteer tourism was sort of handling animal volunteering, volunteering with wildlife, as well as things like orphanages and childcare and community development. And it's like, how do you, my master's thesis sort of picked out, how do you, how as a consumer can you, well, I suppose the question was, as a consumer, can you tell, right, from a website whether someone is or isn't? And I would look at their policies. I would look at how integrated the information is within their sort of product pages. I would look at the way they spoke about it. So was it patronizing? Was it sort of poverty marketing? With something like animals, it's like, are you handling the animals? Because really that's not responsible. So it's like, the minute something is, orphanage tourism full stop is a big no-no. So if someone's selling, if they're saying they're responsible and they're selling orphanage tourism, well, no, sorry, you're not. For reasons I don't need to go into, but ultimately orphanage tourism leads to child trafficking. Yeah, behind the scenes. And so yes, there's lots of things. I would look at their home pages. I would look at the content, that the focus of development that they put on sustainability and how much information there was available. And it is tricky, like you said before, you know, consumers don't necessarily want too much information. And for us who want to transparently give that information, we need to make a sort of cascaded approach of a, you know, come to my site and just phone me if you just want to know, you know, don't bother reading everything. Or if you do want to read it all, there it is, sort of thing, you know. It is challenging.
It is, like you say, it's a cascade. It's what our good friend Sian Conway would call the funnel.
Yes, exactly. Deeper, green, right? Deeper, and you know, another challenge in certainly in tourism, which is where these measuring and monitoring and the certification schemes start to come in, is people measure in different ways and people monitor in different ways. So you're often not comparing apples and apples, right? So, you know, there's massive movements globally as different sectors to start to try and bring all this stuff together, and even be able to compare between one sector to another. So, you know, sustainability is still so new that with, you know, global systems are still working on this. But yes, I mean, I think a lot of the time, probably, you know, you can get a good gut feel, I think, from websites, if you are sensitive to and aware of the issues. If you've never been interested in sustainability, you don't know what the issues are, there's a lot more to learn, probably.
And there are organisations, aren't there? There's a green tourism organisation in the UK.
So that's a certification, for example. Right. So the challenge we have in tourism is, you know, people will say, why isn't there a standard for sustainable tourism in tourism? Sustainability in tourism. We have more than 200 global standards. And that's what I'm talking about, people they're not necessarily comparable. Now, a lot of people have created these certifications in order to make money. And so there's a handful of really good ones. You just mentioned green tourism, that's one. I would probably be able to name, like off the top of my head, 10, 20, who are 10 that are good, 10 others that I might know. who knows who these other 190 odd are, right? Don't even know them. And that's someone who's heavily involved in sustainable tourism, right? Yeah. Some countries have their own. So Costa Rica has its own scheme. Kenya has its own scheme. Iceland, you know, most of the Nordic countries have their own schemes. So that becomes a bit more comparable between the properties there. But ultimately, no tourism organization needs to have a certification in order to create a positive impact. And many good organizations that I know don't get the certifications or don't follow the schemes because it costs them money and their resources they want to put into their actual impacts. So when I determine who I work with on a partner basis, it's not based on certifications, it's based on what their actual impacts are, basically. So, you know, it's a nice and easy way for a consumer to kind of have an idea. It means they're taking it seriously. It means they're paying attention. It means they're learning. It means they're on a journey to improve their sustainability almost, as long as those certifications are renewed every couple of years, whatever it is, because you can't have someone gets it and then 10 years later, they're still claiming it, right?
Yeah, yeah, but it's also the element of if you're just doing it for the certification, that always worries me in with most industries.
And in tourism, it's been proven that doesn't actually lead to more bookings, or hasn't done historically. So it's not, there's no sort of commercial benefit of that to date. I think there will be in time, to be honest, because I think now consumers are working up sustainability in tourism, they will start to pay attention. So, you know, green tourism, I actually worked for green tourism on stage. They're one. I also work for an organization called the Long Run, which is a standard for private protected areas who use tourism for conservation and community benefit. So it's interesting to work for these organizations and see how they certify and see the extent to which and the depth to which they go. And they all differ. Obviously, some are more shallow than others. So, and some are more, you know, we talk about B Corp, for example. B Corp, some travel companies go into B Corp, but B Corp's not travel specific, it goes across sectors. So there's an awful lot of travel issues which aren't central to how a company runs. So let's say me as an online intermediary, I could do a B Corp, but it would be judged on my operations. It's not actually judged on the operations of my suppliers and my supply chain necessarily, I don't think, right? Because so much in travel is travel specific about transfers and all this kind of stuff, right? So you know, travel companies tend to go with travel specific certifications.
Yeah, which makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, my experience, I've been in this working in sustainability now for 13 years, something like that. But people in general, they buy in. Once they buy in, and they find out things. And it's about the stories. It's about the background, personal connection, you know. So I think accreditations are a great way of proving that certain situations, you know, people want to know. But in general, the end consumer wants to have that feeling of understanding and connecting with what they're.
I mean, my view is certifications are great for the organizations for their journey of continuous improvement, basically, in sustainability. You've got a third party saying, have you thought about this, that, and the other? You're not very balanced on that, whatever. That's great. But I don't think it's a consumer marketing.
No, it's helpful, like you say, for the organisation. And in clothing, I think it's for people. It's again for the mass producers. So you don't have to have relationships with all the different suppliers. If they've got certain accreditations, then you can potentially feel confident that they've reached a certain standard. Whether that's true or not is another whole other.
But then you have to know, like, of the certifications, which ones are the good ones and which ones are the less good ones. I know. Because what sort of standard is their standard, right? Exactly. And then in tourism, because we've got so many, we have something called the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, who's like a standard of standards. They're the policeman of the standards a little bit. So if you then accredit your standard as a certification organization with the GSTC, it becomes a kind of more recognized standard.
And some of this is about promotion too, actually. A lot of accreditations is those organizations then get to go onto those accrediting bodies' websites, you know. It gives you a bit more help that way. So anyway, we're going to
talk one interesting thing for greenwashing, whether it is or isn't, is coming up for Blue Monday.
Yes, that was my next point.
Yes. So Blue Monday as a term was another thing coined in tourism.
Oh, tourism leads the way.
You know, we're good at these sort of tactical things, right? in effect, you know, it's post-Christmas, New Year, we've all had lots of fun, we're going into January, it's dark, it's miserable, we're all skint, we've got debts, all the terrible things of January. People, the peak booking time in the Western world is January for booking travel, because people go, oh, I just want to get away, right?
Yeah, and it's something to look forward to.
And so a particular commercial company in not so long ago, mid 2000s, invented the term Blue Monday as the third Monday in January as the most depressing day of the year. And they came up with a kind of equation that said, this is what makes it the third Monday in January is the most depressing time of the year. And in actual fact, obviously the science was completely debunked. It was total nonsense in terms of the equation. But I do buy that, you know, yes, it's the big peak booking time, and yes, people are feeling that way, you know, and that's why it's the peak booking time. And it's not to say that tourism is just a commercial sector. It's also very, very important for people's mental health. Get away from your work, get away from home.
Family time,
but also, you know, going back to the sustainable development goals and inequalities and things, perspective about how other people live, culture, tolerance, how we exist in the world, not as items, but within a greater world ecosystem and community. So, you know, I think there's a really good important message actually around travel and mental health and tolerance, that, you know, for me, and going back to what we started with, aviation, if we took aviation away and you made everyone very insular in their own places where they live, what an awful lot we would miss out on.
Yes. Yeah, and I think education as a parent, you know, education of travel is a huge thing. I mean, this summer we did a interrail around Europe, and my youngest, who was 14 at the time, he said to me afterwards that he absolutely loved, you know, he stayed in I think 10 different cities over the month, and he said to me afterwards that it really opened his eyes to all the different places in Europe that he could live when he's older, you know, and you get that whole respect for different languages, different cultures, you know, and when we travel further afield as well, you start seeing different communities, different customs, different cultures, and then, as you say, that
different ways of running society.
Exactly, and that's it's that tolerance thing that you've already said, but also that
and that's so important to this comes into Sustainable Development Goals 16 and 17 partnerships. So 16 is peace, and travel and tourism is really important to peace. You can't do travel and tourism where there's not peace. We talked about that. War zone's not very easy, but it's such a catalyst. I mean, if everyone in the world had the opportunity to travel and see those different communities and cultures, it would make us very different towards other people, I think.
I agree. I mean, looking at situation in our country politically now, when there's so much government rhetoric to make us, you know, anti-certain anybody who basically who isn't from the UK.
Well, you know, that was the day I absolutely committed. That was the point of no return of my business, was the day of the Brexit vote result. I was like, right, that's it. I'm totally doing this. Because for me, the world isn't about having boundaries and borders. It's about understanding each other and supporting each other.
Exactly. And then you look at the Russia-Ukraine situation, where one of the reasons where hopefully it's all going to fall apart is because a lot of the Ukrainians and Russians have traveled to each other. They know each other, they're friends, you know, they're family, and it's because community will win in the end. I hope, I really hope. But yes, it's a difficult situation, but I agree with you completely. I mean, we know, I'm not going to name any names, but societies where people don't travel very much do tend to be very insular and you know, all sorts of other things, challenges as well, but we won't go into that one too much.
And you know, we're very fortunate. Obviously, we're a minor part of the world in population that gets to travel. And in this country, in the UK, most of us travel.
It's an island. We're an island, you know.
And so, where was I going with that?
We have
in many ways, going back to the aviation thing. In many ways, it's sort of our obligation to actually learn about our place in the world by understanding other places and other people in the world. And you know, that's what development is, and it's not to say other people are wrong if that's not the way they want to do things, but for me it's important part of learning to live all together.
as part of a community on a planet. You know, we all live on the same planet.
Exactly. And you know, for me, we're one ecosystem, and we are, as humans, but one species within that ecosystem.
Exactly right.
And we are not more important than the others.
Than other people or other
the others and not exploit and destroy the others, basically.
Exactly. It's a sharing situation. Anyway, final question, because we're running out of time. What are your top tips for people who want to travel, but they really want to make sure it's as kind as possible, just as we were saying, to the planet, to the other communities, other life forms who live on our planet? What are your top tips?
Yeah, I mean, certainly historically, I would have said, you know, watch the mass tourism providers, because, like I said earlier, most of the money never goes into destinations. That is changing. So it just depends who now. You know, in terms of really big tour operators, TUI have actually done a lot of work on sustainability, but they're the main one. And then some of the other sort of mid-tier companies are coming up and doing, some of the overland companies are doing much more work. You know, it's all about trying to get your money to go direct. So it's why I work as a model. People come to me and inquire, and then when people are ready to book, they actually pay directly, so the money goes directly. It's all about supporting local people, which isn't, you know, always the way, because you get something like orphanage tourism, and that can be local setup, but that can be exploitative, so a bit tricky. But generally, you're wanting to book local, not big global chains. Make sure your money goes local. You know, these days we've got clever technology from Google, Skyscanner, TripAdvisor, etc., who are showing carbon of flights, so you can choose lower carbon options if that's what you want to do, or at least have the information to weigh up and consider the opportunities around that. Always look for evidence for any claims of sustainability. There's something in tourism called the Glasgow Declaration, which is basically the sort of tourism industry declares climate emergency, and the companies who are working towards bringing emissions down 50%. So always worth considering the companies that are there. There's several hundred now, but they're a mere blip on the scale of the thousands and millions of tourism companies worldwide. And then, yeah, I mean, transport, take, you know, walk, bike, local buses, etc. Always minimizing carbon. That's a little bit more difficult with accommodation, because, I mean, what I didn't say earlier was that accommodation also has a significant carbon impact. So you've got to have the behind the scenes data to kind of be able to judge that, which is, you know, where I come in with people to some extent. And activities all have a carbon impact. So yeah, I mean, it's balancing up all these issues of what we know is potentially sustainable development. That's maybe, I'm not sure that was the best answer there.
So the top tip is to go to earth-changes.com.
Yes, absolutely, Jane. Thank you very much.
And no, to find out.
And what I would say is, because of COVID, I've not been able to scale my website as much as I would like. I'm in touch with 250, 300 suppliers all over the world behind the scenes that I can point people to. And even so, if it's not on my website, drop me a note, and I would be able to help probably any destination.
Brilliant. That sounds great. No, it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of interesting things to pull out from there. You mentioned quite a few organizations, so I'll get you to send me links to them, and we'll put that into the podcast text. And so I think we've said already where to find you, but just tell us again what social media you're on, etc., etc.
Yeah, website is earth-changers.com. Instagram @earthchangers in one word. Facebook @earthchangers.travel. Twitter @earth_changers_. It's impossible to get them all the same.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, that'll do for now.
Brilliant. No, that's great. And basically people can get in touch with you if they want to find out more, and
yes, and you know, I kind of can advise people on personal holidays, but also you know, corporate trips, or particularly groups around CSR or anything like that, because ultimately all the destinations I deal with, particularly accommodations, they've got venues who are best practice sustainability around the world. And I just want very interesting places just to see behind the scenes how they operate.
I just want to make one more mention as well, which Vicky's being too kind and nice to mention, and I know this from other friends of mine in the travel industry and other industries. If you go to somebody's website and you browse the holiday destinations, and then you think that's really interesting information, I've learned a lot from that, and then you go off and you book it somewhere else, that is a real challenge for people like Vicky and other organizations, because they put huge amounts of work and effort into running the website, and they're paying, and it's their time. So please, if you are looking at something and you like what you see, do then follow through and do your booking through that organization, because they are then getting the value.
Worth me mentioning, if someone books through me, they book the same public price as they would in the destination. So it's the same price. It's not more expensive or anything like that. It just means that, yeah, I've introduced them, and I have a sort of introductory fee that comes back as, you know, to be transparent as a business model, basically.
Yeah, as small businesses, you know, these things are absolutely key. You know, you don't want to be going to the Amazon of travel. I'm sure they're doing travel now anyway.
Well, everyone's doing travel.
Yeah. Anyway, on that note, thank you so much, Vicky Smith, for joining us on the Where Does It Come From podcast. I hope you've all found it really useful, and that you will be going to have a look and book some holidays through Vicky, and find out more about sustainable travel. So thank you.
Yes, and drop me any questions by all means.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jo.